Okay, so when we're talking about ecological succession, there's two major types. There's primary and there's secondary, but before I get into that, I just want to make sure that everyone knows that when we're talking about succession, we're talking about change in communities. So when you like success or succeeding, sometimes that refers to moving like from one grade to another to another. This is just a change in communities over time. And so we're talking about all the living things in an area changing over time. So maybe one species goes locally extinct and another species comes in to replace it. Maybe the ecosystem becomes more diverse overall as new species are added. But that's what we're talking about when we talk about succession. Anytime you have brand new land, you're looking at primary succession. So examples of where you might find bare land are anywhere you don't find soil. Land scraped clean by glaciers or volcanic land is the primary examples of primary succession. You have to have a very special type of organism to thrive or live on bare rock. You have to have something that can tolerate a huge range of conditions, hot, cold, wet, dry, because rock doesn't hold moisture. There's not going to be shade. So those special species are what we call the pioneer species, and our primary example of that is lichens, which is a symbiotic relationship going on between a fungus, which is able to start chemically breaking down the rock, and some sort of photosynthetic, often it's algae, or, sometimes we talk about cyanobacteria, which are also algae, but they provide nutrients to the fungus while the fungus shelters them from those harsh conditions of living on rock. And so together, they're able to start breaking down the rock and forming soil. So you really can't build an ecosystem without soil. And you can't have soil without some minerals from the rock and some organic matter. So where do you find organic matter? So you find organic matter anywhere you have life. And so there's going to have to be a process here, a process of things growing, taking in CO2 from the air, turning it into organic molecules, and dying and leaving that behind. When you look at similarities between them, that's one, the relying on, additional organic matter accumulating over time. But the big end point we're going to see in both primary and secondary succession is a climax community. And a climax community is simply a community that's going to resist change. Succession is all about change, so the community that's left at the end and can survive for a long period of time is that community that's able to resist change. Going back to what we were talking about before with the organic matter, you're always going to see a pretty common pattern. Succession and the species involved change from state to state, from ecosystem to ecosystem, but the pattern is pretty consistent because only certain types of organisms can live with very thin soil or live in conditions where there's plenty of soil but lots of shade. So here's the pattern. It's going to go from like grasses and shrubs, ferns, move into small bushes and trees, things that don't have to have a lot of depth of their roots because they're not going to grow very tall. Taller trees come later, and they tend to block the shade. So then what is living in the underbrush has to change in response to that shade. Meanwhile, as the plant communities are changing, the animal communities are also changing. And so eventually you end up with these trees with deep roots that can survive even droughts, periods of climate change, and they have long lifespans. And so that's where you're going to see your climax community. Typically, climax communities are pretty biodiverse. There's plenty of animals. They've all developed into, unique niches in that area at the end of succession. So when you look at secondary succession is probably happening all the time. Anywhere you have any kind of disturbance, something that would set succession back to an earlier phase, a more grass-like phase, or weeds, or small annuals, that's a disturbance. So this could be something as simple as grazing, or something as disruptive as a forest fire, hurricanes, tsunamis, mudslides. But the big difference here is you're still going to have soil, and you're still going to have seeds. In primary succession, you literally, if you're looking at a new volcanic island, you would have to wait for birds to fly over and drop seeds, or for things to float through the air. Here, you've already got some parent that has left behind its offspring, the seeds, and so they're ready to just restart from sort of where they left off. So when you look at the relative speed, secondary succession is almost always faster than primary succession. And then just to recap, succession in general is a gradual change in communities as one community is kind of paving the way, like the lichens break down the rock and they pave the way for other species that are going to need soil and moisture retention. But then they get outcompeted by taller things that then block out their sunlight, anything like that.